In this segment, I'm going to show you my favorite text editor and help you get it set up to efficiently code in HTML. Let's get started. I think the best editor for web development, and the editor that I personally use, is Visual Studio Code. You can download it for free at code.visualstudio.com. You can download a version for Windows, a version for Mac, or even a version for Linux. All three versions work exactly the same way. However, they do use different keyboard shortcuts. I'd recommend you download the stable version instead of the insider's version, which includes cutting-edge features that may still be in beta. I'd recommend you pause the video now to download Visual Studio Code and install it on your machine. Visual Studio Code is rich with features, and I'm not going to be going over all of them in this video. I do want to go over a few of the primary features that will be helpful as you get started. You'll notice the Welcome tab comes up automatically when you enter Visual Studio Code. Here you can complete some basic operations like opening a new file, opening a folder, or adding a folder to the workspace. You can also do some basic customizations or take some tutorials on the Visual Studio Code environment. I'm going to start by opening the File Explorer. I can open it by clicking this icon. The File Explorer allows you to open files and folders within a project. Let's go ahead and open a folder that contains some HTML and JavaScript. I'm going to open this folder right here, 0.8. This is actually a version of our website. And you can see now that the Explorer has come alive, and you can see all the individual files that are available in the folder we just opened. If I want to open individual files, I can open them by double-clicking on them in the Explorer, and they'll now be listed under the Open Editors section of the Explorer. We have footer.html and header.html. Notice these files also appear over here as their own editors on the right-hand side of the screen. Of course, editing is pretty straightforward. You just move your cursor to the point where you want to edit and type. You can navigate through a file by using the scroll bars or by using this minified version of your file and navigating that way simply by clicking and dragging. One suggestion I have is that when you open a new file, go to the View menu and choose Toggle Word Wrap. This way, any text that extends off the right-hand side of your editor will be word wrapped so you can see the entire file at one time. One of the nice features inside of Visual Studio Code is the Search and Replace feature under the Edit menu. If I choose Edit and Find, I can find any element that I want simply by typing it. Here I've asked it to find div, which is an HTML tag. It's found 8 instances of it, and I can navigate through them with the arrow keys just like this. Navigate down, and navigate upwards in my code file. If I want to replace anything inside my code, I can choose Edit and Replace, and that adds a Replace text box to the Find and Replace interface. So let's say I wanted to replace Framework Television with my name. It's found 2 individual instances of Framework Television. I can navigate through them in the code file and replace simply by clicking the Replace button right here. Those instances have been replaced. Now, I didn't really want to do that, so this would be a good time to demonstrate the Undo feature, which is Control-Z, as it is universally in most programs. Hit Undo, and then Undo again, and it undoes the replace that I just made. The Visual Studio Code environment is an extension-based environment. There are hundreds of extensions available that extend the abilities of the Visual Studio Code environment. Note that I already have 2 extensions installed, the HTML boilerplate extension and the Tenacious design theme. To search extensions, I can simply give a search term like HTML, and it'll show me all of the extensions that are available. Let's check out this JS CSS HTML formatter extension. For any individual extension, it'll tell me how many downloads, 1.5 million, that's a lot, and also a star rating, as people can rate the individual extensions. 2 stars, that's not very high, so I'm not going to download this one. The extensions also have their own documentation that you should follow in order to use the extension. There are hundreds of extensions that have been created for the Visual Studio Code environment. It's worth exploring. Let's use the extension I already have installed. So in order to use it, I'm going to close up the tab that describes the extension. I'm going to move back to my File Explorer, and I'm going to create a brand new file by clicking File and New File. I'm going to save this new file immediately as an HTML file. To avoid confusion so I can erase it later, I'm going to save it right on my desktop. Let's save this as example.html. I'm now in the example HTML file. So if I type HTML, we get some different options here, but the extension I installed gives me this HTML5 boilerplate option. I'm going to press it, and all of this boilerplate code is entered for me. Boilerplate code being code that you need for almost every HTML file. So this saves me quite a bit of time by providing all of this ahead of time so I don't have to type it out myself. And now I could just go on and start typing inside my document. Extensions are designed to make your life easier as a developer, and I'd recommend that you check for new extensions when you work with different technologies inside VS Studio Code. The last feature I'd like to show you in Visual Studio Code is the integrated terminal. If I go to the Terminal menu and choose New Terminal, I'm now in the terminal or shell, and I can type keyboard commands and interact with the shell using the keyboard. This is useful for issuing commands that only work from the command line. That wraps up our look at Visual Studio Code. I'd recommend that you look at the extensions, you practice with the Explorer, and you look at the features of the Visual Studio Code environment as you get ready to write your first lines of code. In this video, you're going to write your first HTML script, and we're going to take a look at the basic document structure that's common to all HTML documents. Let's get going. The basic document structure is the code that underpins all HTML documents. It's essentially the minimally viable code to have a correct HTML document. In my interface, there's a couple of things I want to point out. The first is the path. Up here, my editor is showing exactly where in my file system this particular file is. It's on my D drive, inside a folder called Dropbox, and inside another series of folders. The file name is called index.html. The name index.html actually is important. The index file is the file that's loaded by default when a server accesses a folder. So if this particular folder had multiple files in it, and no particular file was specified, the index.html file would be loaded. Now, let's go through the basic document structure line by line. Line 1 is actually not HTML. The line is written in a language called SGML, which is Standard Generalized Markup Language. I don't want to get too deep on the weeds in this, but essentially what it does is it declares that the rest of the document is HTML. Doc type HTML simply means our document type is HTML. In line 2 is our opening HTML tag. In the opening HTML tag, there's an attribute that declares the language we're using is English. That's lang equals en. Notice the structure of each individual tag opens with a less than sign, closes with a greater than sign. We're going to simply call the less than and greater than sign brackets for the rest of this course, because in HTML parlance, they are brackets that contain the tag name. The HTML document is broken into two sections, a head and a body section. The head section generally has meta information and links to other files that are important for the HTML document, such as style sheets or JavaScript. The body contains the content that the user will see in the browser window when they view the page. Because this is a basic document structure and not a full HTML document, our body is empty. Inside the head, we have meta tags. Meta tags provide specific information about your document. In this case, the character set, which is the standard UTF-8 character set. And a second meta tag sizes our viewport. It essentially says that our viewport should be as wide as the screen that it's being displayed on, and that the scale should be 1.0 or 100%. The title tag completes our head section at this point. The title tag has a name, basic document structure, which just gives a title to the document. The title tag is important for a couple of different reasons. The content of the title tag, basic document structure, appears in the tab when this document is opened in a browser. Secondly, the title tag is used as a default name if the page is bookmarked. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, if this page is indexed by Google or another search engine, the title tag provides the name of the individual page that's displayed in the search engine. It also should provide some guidance as to the topic of the page for indexing purposes. After the title tag, we close out the head, and we go to the body section of the document. We have our opening body tag on line 8, our closing body tag on line 10, and then finally, line 11 closes out the HTML with the HTML closing tag. Let's look more closely at the idea of tags. You'll note our document is made up of a number of individual tags, and tags are most often found in pairs. An opening tag, like the body tag on line 8, or the opening HTML tag on line 2. And closing tags, like the closing body tag on line 10, or the closing HTML tag on line 11. An opening tag, a closing tag, and the content inside makes up what is called an element. Collectively, lines 3 to line 7 contain the head element. They contain the opening head tag, the content, which is the meta tags and title, and the closing head tag. The entire HTML tag, starting on line 2 and closing on line 11, comprises the HTML element in our document. Some elements, like the HTML element on line 2 and the meta elements on line 4 and 5, have attributes. Attributes modify an element. Lang, short for language, modifies the HTML element on line 2, and it's assigned a value, which is in quotes, en. On line 4, charset, short for character set, modifies the meta tag. Its value, again in quotes, is set to UTF-8. Elements can have a couple of different types of content. They can have other elements as content. They can have text content, like the title element on line 6, where the content is the text basic document structure, or they can have a combination of the two. The head element has a combination of element content and text content. At this point, I recommend you pause the video and type the basic document structure exactly as you see it here. Save it and use that basic document structure as a template every time you start a new HTML page. This way you won't have to type this content over and over again each time you start a new page. There are a number of different tags that are used to mark up text in HTML. We're going to be going over most of them in this video. Let's get started. Before writing the code for this section, I installed a pretty cool extension for Visual Studio Code called Open in Browser. With Visual Studio Code, you can actually open the browser to see the results of your HTML with the keystroke Alt-B. This will make it a lot easier to check the results of our HTML code. I'd suggest you pause the video now and install Open in Browser in your own Visual Studio Code install. To demonstrate the heading tags in HTML, I've created this HTML document. We've got the standard head and body section, and inside the body you can see the individual heading elements. We have an H1 element for the primary heading, an H2 element for the secondary heading, and an H3 element for the tertiary or third heading. You can also create minor headings with H4, H5, and H6. However, there is no H7 and beyond. For me, I've rarely used anything beyond H4. However, I understand some scientific documents have multiple levels of headings and may require you to use H5 and H6. Let's take a look at these when rendered in the browser. Note that I've increased the size of the text here to make it easier for you to see. You can see the result of H1, this is a primary heading, H2, this is a secondary heading, all the way through H6 in this HTML document. HTML uses a concept known as semantic HTML. What that means is that the individual tags or elements should be self-documenting. A heading tag describes the fact that it is indeed a heading. That is not related to what a tag actually looks like when rendered in the browser. The default style sheet makes our headings big and bold. However, if we wanted to, we could make our headings be identified by individual colors or some other visual element. The fact that they're big and bold is just how the default style sheet is interpreting headings. What this means for you as a developer is that you should keep in mind that no particular tag is tied to a specific look in the browser. That's all defined by the style sheet and can be redefined with your own CSS code. Aside from heading tags, the paragraph tag is frequently used for text markup. The paragraph tag contains, you guessed it, paragraphs. I've written a short paragraph about my hometown of Westport, Connecticut inside this particular paragraph tag. We could put as much text as we want inside a single paragraph tag. Staples High School is located in Westport. It's possible and even likely that you'll have one text tag inside another. For example, let's use the strong tag here. So we have our opening strong tag, and then our closing strong tag, and inside it is the word Westport. That means inside this paragraph, we are formatting the word Westport with the strong tag and only the word Westport, simply because the tag ends, or the element ends, right after the word Westport. We could also use the emphasis tag in the same way. In the default style sheet, the strong tag makes text bold, the emphasis tag italicizes text. But again, that's just default behavior and could be altered by any CSS code that you write. Let's save this document. I'm going to use Control-S as a shortcut, and let's take a look at the result in our browser. Again, I've magnified the results here so you can more easily see the text. So you'll notice we have our entire paragraph, and we have the word Westport bolded and the word Staples High School in italics. Exactly what you'd expect based on the markup that I've written. A note on the default behavior of the paragraph tag. I'm going to take this entire paragraph tag and make a copy of it and place that copy directly below the original. I'm going to save again with Control-S. And now we have two copies of the same paragraph. Here you can see the two paragraphs rendered in the browser window. Notice that by default, there's space between each paragraph. This space is also created by the default style sheet. The space is a combination of margin and padding space. But each paragraph tag exists in its own box that includes that margin and paragraph space. Paragraph tags are a very basic unit of markup in HTML. HTML5 doubled down on the concept of semantic markup. If you look in the body of this HTML document, you'll see a number of additional tags that are used to describe the content that will eventually go inside them. Notice we have on line 9 the header tag, and on line 17 the footer tag. This, of course, reserves space for the header and footer of our document. We've got a couple of heading tags, H1 being the most important, H2 being secondary in importance. And then we've got an article tag. What goes inside an article tag? Well, it's semantic HTML, so we know that's for an article. This article contains a summary inside a summary element and 2 paragraph tags. You'll notice that these tags seem to form a hierarchy, and that hierarchy is very important within HTML. Keep in mind that within the hierarchy, every tag must be closed, and the tag must be closed with correct nesting. That means you don't end one tag before ending a tag that started inside it. Here are all of the elements populated with text. You can see we've got text in the header, the H1, the H2. Inside the article element, we only have other elements, but that includes the summary and 2 paragraphs. And then we have the footer at the bottom. I'll add a copyright statement here. So let's take a look at the result of this inside the browser. And here you can see the result of the HTML, from the header at the top to the footer at the bottom. And all of the text has been rendered according to the HTML. Now, of course, the styles here are pretty basic. They're based on the default style sheet in the browser. As a developer, you would use CSS to then enhance the look of this document. However, our HTML, because we use semantic HTML, documents the content well, and we can tell the purpose of each and every element inside of our code. Every good development instructor will tell you, comment your code. HTML is no exception here. Good HTML code is well commented. I'm going to show you how to use the comment tags in this video. Let's get going. It might be helpful to keep in mind that there are 2 actual audiences for your code. The first audience is the web browser or mobile app that's going to decipher your HTML. And the second is a human developer or engineer who will inherit your code after you go off and get a better job. Seriously, though, commenting your code is an important part of making your code readable for human beings. You may even forget what a section of your code was intended to do after a period of time. You can see a standard HTML comment starts on line 5 and ends on line 7. The starting tag, for lack of a better word, and ending tag enclose the comment. Everything in between the starting tag on line 5 and the closing tag on line 7 is part of the comment. When the browser reaches a comment, when it's deciphering your HTML, it simply ignores it. It doesn't read what's between the opening and closing tag. You may want to put comments about the code, about who wrote it, or when. You may also want to put explanations of why you coded certain elements a certain way. Here I've made a comment about the viewport, and I dated it on lines 5 and 6. Comments are also useful for isolating errors. If part of your code isn't working, you can isolate where the error is using comment tags. For example, let's comment out line 13. So I'll add the opening and closing comment tags. This works on a single line or within multiple lines. So notice first, within our development environment, the commented line turns green. That simply indicates a comment. This line will not be read by the web browser. Let's save. I'm going to hit Control-S, and let's render our code in the browser. So you'll note the results of the H1 tag are showing, and the results of the paragraph tag are showing. However, the H2 tag, which has been commented out, doesn't show in the results. Let's remove the comment. And now you can see the tag is no longer commented out, and the line "Not all comments are created equal" appears. By commenting out lines one by one, it's easier to isolate errors in your HTML and correct them. One thing we've learned about how people consume content on the web over the years is that they're less likely to read and more likely to scan. That's why lists can be your friend. We'll learn how to make several different types of lists with HTML in this segment. Here, my browser is displaying two different types of lists. Notice the first list is enumerated with digits. Apple IIe is number 1, Commodore 64 is number 2, Atari 800 is number 3, and so on. The second list, a few towns in Connecticut, is a bulleted list. Here, each member of the list is preceded by a bullet symbol. Let's take a look at the HTML code I used to make these lists. Of course, we have our standard document structure, and inside the body we have an H1 for the most important header on the page, which says HTML5 lists, and then an H2. That labels the first list, which is 6 old school computers. Technically, you should use an ordered list when you have a specific number of something. Here we have 6 old school computers. Now let's take a look at the list structure below the H2 tag on line 10. So the entire ordered list is encased in an OL element. That element starts with the opening tag on line 11 and closes with the closing tag on line 18. Each member of the list is enclosed in an LI or list item tag. Each of these LI elements serves as a separate member of the list. So we have Apple IIe, Commodore 64, and so on. We know the list is complete when we get to the closing OL tag on line 18. Our second list is a little different. As you saw, it's an unordered or bulleted list. It's labeled by an H2 on line 19. The UL element starts on 20 and ends on 27, and each of the list items is enclosed inside that element. We have a list item for the town of Westport, a list item for the town of Trumbull, and a list item for the town of Milford, and so on. What's interesting here is both the ordered list and the unordered list use the same list item tag internally, but they're rendered slightly differently. You'll remember that the ordered list uses numbers, and the unordered list uses bullets. We do have some control over how a list is enumerated. On line 11, I'm going to add the type attribute. And the value of that type attribute is going to be a capital I. So now our ordered list is modified by type equals capital I. And if you look at our list elements, each one is now numbered with a Roman numeral. That's instead of the standard numbering system we had by default. Let's look at one more type. I'm going to edit the value of the type attribute to a capital A and save once again. And when we bring it up in the browser, now our values are enumerated by capital letters, A, B, C, D, and so on. We could add a member of the list very easily, simply by adding a new list item element and populating it with text. Let's add the Commodore 128, one of my favorite computers from that era. We'll save again, take a look at the result in the browser, and you'll note that element G has been added, Commodore 128. The unordered list operates in a similar fashion. We also have type values for the unordered list. The type values include disk, circle, and square. Let's render this as a square and take a look at the result in the browser. And now you can see our list items are all rendered with a square bullet instead of the standard circle. There is another type of list, and it's called a description list. it uses a totally different set of tags. The entire description list is enclosed in a DL element. And then the list is made up of terms in DT elements and descriptions in DD elements. So let's say we wanted to describe a couple of Connecticut cities. So let's do New Haven, and we'll describe this as the home to Yale University. And we'll do one more, a DT element and a DD element. So we'll describe Hartford as the capital city in Connecticut. This third type of list is not used as often, but let's take a look at how it's rendered inside the browser by default. And here you can see there's no bullets, there's no numbering, but the actual descriptions of each term are indented. It looks kind of like a dictionary entry. Now you can write three types of lists in HTML: an ordered list, an unordered list, and a description list. Not to make your life more complicated, but styling text with HTML requires yet another language called CSS, Cascading Style Sheet Language. I'm going to introduce you to CSS so you can style your text in this segment. Let's get started. As I've mentioned before, the real work of changing the appearance of elements is the job of CSS, Cascading Style Sheet Language. I'm going to introduce some CSS to you here, but this is hardly a comprehensive look at CSS and text styling. CSS is worth a course of its own. Let's get started by creating a place to put our CSS. If you're putting your CSS in the same document as the HTML, typically it will go at the head inside of style tags. The opening style element on line 7 tells the browser that the text inside this element will be CSS, not HTML. So inside the style element, we're going to dispense with the typical HTML style of opening and closing tags and use the CSS syntax. The CSS syntax requires that we have a selector and then rules to apply to the selector. We're going to use article as our selector. That'll select all of the text inside an article element. You'll notice that in our HTML, all of the text is inside the article element. So any change here we make within the article selector will be applied to all the text. Let's start with font family. And this is how we choose a particular typeface for our document. You'll notice that our text editor is giving us a number of different options here. These are the standard options that we would assume the end user would have on their machine. Let's choose Arial, Helvetica, Sans Serif. What this means is it'll first try to apply the Arial font, and if that doesn't exist, it'll apply Helvetica. And if Helvetica doesn't exist, it'll apply any sans serif font on the machine. A sans serif font being a font that doesn't have the little tails at the ends of the letters. Let's save with Control S and take a look in the browser. And you can see our text is now being rendered in the Arial font. Again, because we use the article tag as our selector, all of the text inside the article tag is affected. If we changed our selector to H1, now we're using the heading 1 selector. And if I save and we again look at the result in the browser, you'll see that just the heading negative space is affected, and the rest of the text is still rendered in the standard and default Times New Roman font. We could choose another font family from the list here. For example, Franklin Gothic Medium. This will try Franklin Gothic Medium, Arial Narrow, Arial, and then any sans serif. Let's take a look at the result. And that's a font I like quite a bit. So if we were to look at this list of fonts that are available, these standard fonts are pretty limited, although these are common and popular. If you want a greater choice in fonts, you can use an option like Google Fonts. Available at fonts.google.com, Google Fonts gives you hundreds and hundreds of fonts to choose from. The way this works is the fonts are downloaded dynamically from Google by your browser before they're rendered. If we want to use a specific font, we can simply select it. It'll give us more information about the font. And if we click Download Family, it'll download the font family to our machine. If we choose Select this style and then Embed, it'll actually give us the code we can paste in order to use this font. So in order to use Anton, I'm going to paste this link into my code. And then for the font family rule, I'm simply going to use the selection right here, just like that. So now the link on line 7 will actually download the font, and the CSS on line 10 will apply the font. Let's save with Control S and take a look at a result in the browser. And there you can see now that specific text is rendered using the Anton font. We certainly can use more than one font on a page. So for example, if we wanted to use the paragraph selector to select the paragraph tags, we could render the rest of the text using Arial, Helvetica, or sans serif, just like that. So now all of the text on the page has been assigned a specific font. And these actually look kind of nice together, so I think I'm going to retain these selections. In addition to choosing a font family, we can choose a font size. There is a font size rule in CSS. There's several different ways we can measure the size of the font. The first is in pixels. Let's set our H1 to 50 pixels. And here you can see it's approximately 50 pixels from the top to the bottom of a capital letter. More common than pixels is to use ems. I'm going to use 2em as our size. And there you can see a little bit smaller. An em is based on the user's selection for the font size. So if a user were to increase the font size, the ems would increase along with it. If you select a pixel font size and the user were to increase the font size, there wouldn't be a change. So using ems gives the user control over the actual font size. And this is important because visually impaired users may need to increase the standard font size when viewing a page. With ems, you can still have the relative font size different from each other. This will still be 2em or twice whatever the user's baseline normal is. If we choose 4em here, it's 4 times the user's baseline choice. And if we choose a number less than 1, it'll be smaller than the user's baseline choice. I think 2em was about right for this selection, so I'm going to leave it there. There is one more type of measurement for font size that's becoming more common, and that's VW and VH. If I choose 2VW and we take a look at the result, that looks kind of small. Each letter is 2% of the entire viewport width. So if we change the width of the viewport, notice the size of the letters change along with it. This is great for something called responsive design, where you're designing your website to respond to the size of the screen. Let's change this to something more reasonable. Let's change it so each letter is 5% of the width of the viewport. I think that's a little more reasonable. And again, as our viewport gets bigger, so does our text. This works on the vertical as well. We can use VH for 5% of the viewport height. And now our text will adjust with the height of the viewport. I'm going to switch this back to 2M, my preferred measurement. Font weight and font style are two other rules we can add. Font weight essentially is the boldness of our font. So I'm going to choose font weight bold, and you will see the actual paragraph text will be bold. We can choose font style instead or in addition to, and italicize the individual text. The last rule I'm going to show you is to align individual text. We use text align and set it to center as opposed to right or left. And now you can see our H1 element is centered inside the space. Again, these are just a few of the CSS rules that can be applied to text, but this will certainly get you started with your typography in HTML. We kind of take color for granted, but in HTML we use a specific system for identifying colors called the hexadecimal color system. I'm going to explain it and show you how to use it in HTML in this segment. Hope you think it's colorful. Your monitor uses the RGB color system, where each pixel is lit by a combination of red, green, and blue light. When we're creating colors using HTML, we also use the RGB color system. Red, green, and blue light are selected and mixed with 256 separate intensities for each color. Let's take a look at how. Here I've got my basic document structure and a style rule that's styling our H1 element in the font family Bungee from the Google Fonts list in a font size of 10 VW. So we could add a color rule, and we could actually choose from named colors like black, orange, or perhaps a few you're not familiar with like chartreuse. However, if we want to use the RGB color system, we've got to provide the intensities for the red, green, and blue colors. So let's choose RGB, and now we can provide three separate colors. So if we use 255, 0, 0, that's red, and the result will be an intense red. If we choose 0, 255, 0, the result will be an intense green. You can see that our text editor gives us a color tile, so we can determine what the color will actually look like. And of course, if we use 0, 0, 255 as our color formulation, we're going to get a blue color. We can mix these three colors in any intensity to make all sorts of different colors. Here you can see that 175, 255 makes a purple color, and 10, 45, 18 gives us a greenish black. You will also see colors indicated using the hexadecimal color system. These are still RGB colors, but the numbers are expressed as hexadecimal numbers. That means instead of from 0 to 255, the red, green, and blue values are expressed as 0 to FF. The hexadecimal color system is based on 16 instead of being based on 10. So FF is equivalent to 255, and 00 is equivalent to 0. Here we've made kind of a lime green color. When looking at an RGB color, the color always starts with a pound sign. The first two values determine the red, the second two the green, and the third two the blue. So FF0000 again gives us an intense red, and 0000FF will give us the intense blue. There are loads of resources available to help you mix colors and make appropriate choices within your HTML. You probably don't even think about them anymore, but you're constantly clicking on hyperlinks to move within documents on the web and from one document to another. I'm going to show you how to code hyperlinks in this segment. Let's go. If you're like most people, you probably take hyperlinks for granted at this point, and they're not terribly difficult to code in HTML. You do have to be aware, however, that there are a couple of different types of links, and we're going to start with external links. External links link your page to another site or domain. I've already got an external link here as an example. If I click on the link for Framework Television, we move to the Framework Television site. If I click the back button on my browser, we go back to the page which is currently stored on my drive. Let's take a look at the code that makes this happen. So inside the body of our basic document structure, we have an H1, an H2, and then we have a paragraph tag, and immediately following the paragraph tag is the anchor tag. That's how we create links. The anchor tag has an href attribute. The value of the href attribute is the fully qualified domain name of the link. The anchor tag ends at the end of the text that you want to be a clickable part of the link. So let's say we wanted to make the word Dell link to the Dell website. First thing I'm going to do is deploy my anchor tag and close it where I want the link to end. In this case, I only want the word Dell to be clickable as part of the link, so the anchor tag begins before the word Dell and ends directly afterwards. Now we'll add our href attribute. And again, because this is an external link going to a different site, I need to put the fully qualified domain name here, which is simply dell.com. Now, so I don't make anybody upset, we also have a link to Apple to practice with. So again, I'm going to surround the word or words that I want to be clickable as the link with the anchor tag. I'll then add my href attribute and set the value equal to, in quotes, the fully qualified domain name, including the protocol, HTTP, and the address, apple.com. I'm going to save my document, and let's take a look at how this works in the browser. So you'll notice the standard blue underline indicating the links. And if we click on the link for Dell, we go to the Dell homepage. And if we click on the link for Apple, we go to the Apple homepage. Again, these are external links going from our site to another site on the internet. Let's create an internal link. I created another page here, which is called hometown.html. And it simply includes an image of the beach. We can take a look at it here. So I want to link from my links page to that page. Now, this is an internal link. Both of these files are in the same folder and saved on my drive. They could just as easily be saved on a web server. So I'm going to create the link around the term beach in my hometown. So the process starts initially the same. Open anchor, close anchor, then add the href. Since this is a local link, I'm simply going to indicate the page that we're linking to. And we get some help from our development environment here. Visual Studio Code shows us a list of pages in the folder. Let's go with hometown.html. Notice there's no HTTP, there's no domain name, just the actual file name of the page we want to move to. Again, we can save our page. And let's bring up the result. And of course, the text beach in my hometown is linked. And here we go. But when we get to this other page, we're at what's called a dead end. And you want to avoid dead ends when you're developing websites. There's nowhere to go. There's no link here. The user has to click the back button in order to go back where they came from to navigate away from the page. This is bad form. So let's go to the hometown HTML page and let's create a link to go back. So the text is going to be back, we'll put that in a p tag. And then again, surround that by our anchor tags and add our href attribute and its value, which in this case will be links.html. Now that we have this, we can go round trip between the two pages. Let's go back to links.html, take a look at it in the browser. So we can click the link to Beach in My Hometown and the backlink to go back where we came from. So the thing to remember when looking at external and internal links is that with external links, you're going to link to the fully qualified domain name. And with internal links, you're just moving locally from one page to another, so you're going to use the file name as the value of the href attribute. Now that we've looked at external and internal links, let's move on to anchors. If we take a look at this page in the browser, it's quite long. There's a lot of text here, especially if someone's looking at it on a browser that doesn't stretch all the way across their screen. If we adjust our browser width, now this page is extremely long, and we might want to have some internal navigation within the page. That's where anchors come in. If we look at the code for this page, quite obviously we've got a lot of content here. Up at the top, we've got our meta tags, and then style information, which is used to style the different tags in our document. Let's scroll down to the beginning of the body. And this is where we're going to put our links. I'm going to put a comment here indicating that. So now let's put our anchors exactly where we want to navigate to. And we're going to navigate to the individual sections of the document. So here, where we have our H2, right before it, I'm going to put the anchor. A name equals Latin. Just like that. We're going to use an anchor tag, the name attribute, and then a value that we want to use for this particular anchor. Let's do one more. So we'll call this one conclusion. A name equals conclusion, closing anchor tag. Notice there's nothing inside the actual anchor element. It's blank. This is just to give us a location that we can move to. In fact, if we were to look at this in the browser, we would see that there's no actual visual representation of this. Here's It's All Latin to Me. As you can see, with It's All Latin to Me and an interesting conclusion, there's no visual representation of the anchor. Now, if we scroll up to the top, we're going to create links to our two anchors. So A href equals pound. So the first anchor is Latin. And we'll just use the word Latin to indicate that. And the second one is conclusion. And we'll use the word conclusion to navigate to that anchor. So another use of the anchor tag here, href attribute, and then a pound sign in the name of the anchor we created. Let's save and take a look in the browser. And as you can see, these are styled like typical links. And if I click Latin, we move to that section of the document. This would be easier to see if we made this thinner again. Latin or conclusion. So notice we navigate within the document with these anchors, conclusion. Let's add one more at the top. So the physical anchor, we use A and the attribute name, and then we leave the element empty. We'll put the actual link, however, at the bottom. So I'll scroll down to the bottom. We'll put the link right here. Text is back to top. A href pound top. And then we'll close the anchor right there. So because we used #top, this will navigate back to, at the very top of our document, the anchor we created right here, this named anchor top. Let's test it in the browser. Sure, we've refreshed. So this will be at the bottom, back to top, and there we go. This can be extremely useful for navigating very long documents. In fact, it's almost expected that if you have a long document, you're going to provide some type of internal navigation that the user can use. Let's move back to our links document. Here is the HTML, and let's take a look at the document in the browser window. And notice all of our links are purple because they've been visited. Before they were visited, our links were blue. Let's talk about how we change the colors of the text of our individual links. And you want to be somewhat careful doing this because users are used to seeing blue and purple links. What we're going to do is we're going to create a style rule for our anchor tags. We're going to use :link to change the color of an unvisited link. And we can choose any color we want here. Let's choose red. For a link that's been visited, we use :visited. And for a visited link, let's choose the color purple. And we also can select a color for when you're hovering over an individual link. Let's go with the color plum. So now, any link that hasn't been visited will be red, any link that has been visited will be purple, and any link that you're hovering over will be plum. So if we look at this in the browser, because all our links are visited, they're purple. If we hover over the individual links, they turn to the plum color, and any unvisited link will, according to the code, appear as red. All right, so we've gone over internal links, external links, internal anchors to navigate within a page, and finally, choosing colors for your hyperlinks. They say a picture's worth 1,000 words, and in this segment, we're going to learn how to include images in our HTML code. Let's get going. I've already created this basic document structure saved in a file called image.html. The title of our document is Summerlin, which happens to be a section of the Las Vegas metro area. You'll notice that the folder where this document is stored is also open on my desktop. You can see the image.html file in there, and also two photographs, one labeled summerlin1.jpg and the other summerlin2.png. These are the images we're going to display with our HTML. To display the images, we're going to use the image tag, img. That's paired with the source attribute, which indicates the source of the image. In this case, it's simply the file name, summerlin1.jpg. If the image resides on another domain, you would see the fully qualified domain name as the value of the source attribute. You might have noticed that the image tag doesn't have a formal close. There's no /img. The slash inside the image tag closes it, and that's because the image tag is an empty tag. You can't have any content between an opening and closing image tag, so developers frequently use the shortcut close that you see. You'll also see the image tag left open like that. Either is correct. So there we've got our file name in the source attribute, our image tag. Let's take a look at the results inside our browser. And there you can see a photo of a shopping area in Summerlin. Let's go ahead and use the image tag again to display our second photo. img, source attribute, and the second photo is summerlin2.png. I'll again use the shortcut close to close the tag. Now when I save with Control S, and we take a look at the result in the browser, we'll see both photographs. Notice that the photographs are displayed one next to another, and that's because the image tag in HTML is an inline tag. That means any images you display will run along the same baseline as text would. Just as if you had typed two letters and they would appear next to each other, two images appear next to each other. If we wanted the images to appear on separate lines, we could use the break tag. Here I'll add a break tag after the first image. The tag is BR. This is also an empty tag, so you can use the shortcut close. I'm going to save, and now that we have the break tag, the images appear one on top of another. If I scroll down, you can see the second image of the Las Vegas baseball stadium. If you've been watching carefully, you may have noticed that we have two different file types for our images. The first is a JPEG, and the second is a PNG or PNG image. There's actually three separate file types we can use to display images in HTML. The first type, which we're actually not using in this particular HTML file, are GIF images, sometimes pronounced GIF. GIF images are flat artwork. They're generally limited to 256 colors, so they're good for things like logos or cartoons. GIF files are compressed by limiting the number of colors in the file. All files displayed in a web browser are in a compressed file format. That's so bandwidth isn't wasted in transmitting a file that's either too large or has too much image information to display inside a website. The second common file type found on the web are JPEG files. JPEGs are for photographic style artwork. It's really just a grid of pixels, each pixel being one of the 16.7 million colors that are available in the RGB color gamut. JPEG uses lossy compression, and what that means is the more an image is compressed, the more quality is lost. JPEG files are compressed by making adjacent similarly colored pixels the same. The final common file type for images displayed on the web are PNG files. These are used for photographic or flat artwork. There's two styles of PNG files, the PNG 8-bit and the PNG 24-bit. The PNG 8-bit is limited in colors and has a smaller file size. The PNG 24 displays any color in the RGB gamut, but it's a larger file size. PNG files can be animated or transparent. Whenever you use images in HTML, you should use the alt attribute, like this. ALT, and then a description of your image. We'll use shopping in Summerlin for the first one. You should be aware that your HTML code should provide accessibility to people with disabilities. What this alt attribute does is allow someone using a screen reader to have text substituted for the image in case of a visual impairment. Let's add an alt attribute to the second image. We'll call this one Las Vegas Stadium. Now, unless you're using a screen reader, these alt attributes have no actual impact on the appearance of the website. But for someone who is using a screen reader, it makes the images accessible to them. So it's important to do this inside your HTML code. One thing to be aware of is that people will often be viewing your image on different size screens. But your image has a fixed size, a fixed number of pixels. That's where responsive design techniques come into play. Responsive design techniques allow your content to adjust to the size and pixel depth of the screen that it's being viewed on. So to make an image responsive, you can do the following. We're going to add a little CSS, so I'm going to add a style element, and inside the style element, we'll use IMG as the selector to select our image tag. You'll notice, by the way, that the second image has been commented out for the purpose of this demonstration. Inside the selector, I'm going to set the width to 100% and the height to auto. Let's save our document and take a look at how this looks in the browser now. And you'll notice that your image occupies the width of the browser. However, if the browser is smaller, the image adjusts for the width of that particular browser window. Another way to do this is to set a maximum width. So if we set this as max width 100%, the image will scale down, but never scale up from its original size. One more thing to think about when it comes to images are image links. Image links work just like links for text. We use the anchor tag and an href attribute. Here I've got 3 buttons that should have image links. Let's take a look. Each one of these buttons is designed to link to a different video in this series. Let's create the links in HTML. I've put the addresses of the videos down here at the bottom of our HTML script. So to create the links, we'll use the anchor tag, followed by the href attribute. We'll close the anchor element at the end of our image tag, and then we'll insert the correct URL. Let's repeat the process for the additional images. And one more to go. And here's our third URL. Again, let's save our document and take a look at the result in the browser. Here are our links. If we click on them, they go directly to the videos that are indicated in the URL. As the web developed, one of the things that made the web exciting was the ability to include audio and video content on a web page. I'm going to show you the HTML code for audio and video right now. Here I've got my basic document structure. I've used playing media as the content for our title tag here because that's exactly what we'll be doing. And I've saved it in a folder where I also have 4 pieces of media. I have 2 audio files called EDM-MP3 and EDM.wave, and then I have 2 video files, one in MOV format and one in MP4 format. Let's start by putting an audio tag inside the body. So of course the audio tag is just audio, and that is paired with the controls attribute. The controls attribute is either expressed as just controls or controls equals controls, depending on the style of HTML that the author is using. I happen to be more formal with my HTML, so I always have an attribute and value together. So controls equals controls will turn on the actual audio controls for the user, play, pause, etc., in a format determined by the browser that the user has open. So inside the audio tag, we have a source tag. And that has an src attribute, and that is set to the actual source of the media, or the file that contains the media. So let's start with edm.wave. We'll shortcut close source because it's an empty tag. And then I'm going to put a secondary source, which is edm.mp3. Essentially what's going to happen here is when the audio tag is encountered, it's going to attempt to play the first source, and if the browser can't play a WAV file, it'll play the MP3 file. Let's save our document and test in the browser. And I happen to be using the browser Edge here from Microsoft, and this is how Microsoft styles the audio player. We can press play and pause to control the audio playing. You can see that it has a clock here to show you how much time has elapsed and how much total time is the audio. And then we have a volume control, which also acts as a mute control. So it's either playing edm.wave or edm.mp3. I'm actually not sure which is supported by this particular browser, but it doesn't really matter. That's why I recommend providing multiple formats of media, because one is bound to be supported by the browser that your user is looking at your page with. There's another attribute that you sometimes see used with the audio tag, and that's autoplay. And if you turn on autoplay, save, watch what happens when we load this into the browser. So you'll notice that without me pressing the play button, it started playing. Now, a warning, users find this annoying, so you don't want to unexpectedly start audio or video for that matter without the user pressing play. The case for using this would be where the audio content is loaded dynamically and you want it to play as soon as it loads. Note that autoplay is disabled in many mobile browsers, and that's to prevent you from using bandwidth without the owner's permission. So I'm going to take out the autoplay attribute. Just as long as you're aware of it, that's fine. Now let's go on to the video tag. The video tag works exactly the same way as the audio tag. The attributes are the same, and the source tag within the video tag works exactly the same way. We have two possible video files here, both depict the same thing. Let's try the MOV first. And then if the MOV doesn't work, we'll have our browser try the MP4 file. Save our document. And let's try this in the browser. And here you can see our video file. There's a play button down here. And when I play it, you see the dancing fountains in front of the beautiful Bellagio Hotel in Las Vegas. We can also pause the video, and if the video had audio, there's volume controls. This control allows the user to full screen the video, and then you have this 3-dot menu here, which allows picture-in-picture, which is a feature of the Edge browser that actually I haven't used. I'm not totally sure what it does. All right, let's go ahead and go back to the code. We'll review it one more time. So with audio, our controls displays the actual audio controls. The source tag has an SRC attribute which points to the media file, and the video tag works exactly the same way. The only other thing to note here with the video tag is you can use CSS to size the actual video. For example, if I add a style sheet here to the head and use video as my selector, I can set the width to 50%. And now when we take a look at this in the browser, you can see that our video is 50% of the browser width. You can also see our audio is still here right next to it because we haven't used a break tag to move the actual video below the audio. Let's do that. And now they'll appear one on top of another. And our video is 50% of the browser width. So if we reduce the browser width, the video gets smaller, always occupying that 50%. If we wanted to, we could also set a width in a definite number of pixels, like that, 600px. So now our browser will display our video player at 600 pixels across, regardless of the width of the browser. And there you can see is our video player. And if I change the width of the browser, the width of the video player is not affected. All right, so now you know how to display media inside a web page using HTML. As your web layouts get more complex, you're going to need to be able to put your content into different containers. There are two generic containers that developers use a lot, the div and the span. You'll see both of them in this segment. Here I've created a short informational page about Lake Las Vegas. I've included an image and some text. Let's take a look at the code. So our code includes some style information in CSS inside of a style element, which starts on line 7. And in the body, we have an H1, and then several paragraphs. The first paragraph includes an image called lake.ping. The div and span tags allow us to create artificial sections or divisions within our code. These sections or divisions can be used to isolate elements for CSS formatting or even for JavaScript, so they can be coded for interaction. Let's create our first logical division. Let's say we wanted to isolate the first two paragraphs. I would just surround them with a logical division tag, div. We'll close that logical division where we want the division to end. So now we have a logical division that starts on 23 and ends at the end of line 26. In order to access this division from CSS, in order to style it, we need to give it an ID attribute. The ID attribute then has a value which is essentially the name of this ID. We'll call it open for opening. When you use an ID, you can only use a named ID once on a page. So this is the only ID with the value open we can use. We can create other IDs with different names, but this is open. We'll access it through CSS like this. Open. And then we can add any styles that we want to that logical division. To make it easy to see, I'm simply going to color it red. So now this rule applies to the ID open. You see the pound sign and the word open on line 20, and that refers to the logical division we've ID'd as open that starts on line 27. Notice the value open. Let's take a look at this in the browser. I'll save with Control S. And now you can see in the browser that the text inside that logical division is red, while the balance of the text remains the default black color. Logical divisions, or divs, are really designed to enclose entire elements. However, if we wanted to include just a few words of text, we wouldn't use a logical division, we'd use a span. I'm going to put a span tag around the text Lake Las Vegas. Now, I could give this span an ID similar to how the div on line 27 has the ID with the value open. But instead, I'm going to give it a class. The difference is a class can be repeated more than once inside of an HTML document. And let's make this class value placename. If we go up to our CSS again, I can create an entry for placename and format the text inside that span. I'll put it right below our ID open selector. For IDs, we use a pound, but for classes, we use a period to precede them in the selector. Placename. So let's make anything in the placename font weight bold, and let's also color it differently from the other text. Instead of red, let's use a blue color. So now, when we look in the browser, notice that our span, which includes the text Lake Las Vegas in paragraph 1, is blue and bold. Because we used a class, we can use that class name again for other spans. So let's take this text, Lake Las Vegas, again, surround it with a span tag, and make the class placename. So we've used that class placename twice, but we can do that because it's a dot, it's a class, versus an ID, which we could only use once. Let's check the result. And there you can see the second instance of Lake Las Vegas in blue, bold text in the second paragraph. So we've created one logical division, which begins on line 32 and closes on line 35, that actually has two spans within it. It's important to think of your HTML as a hierarchy, and divs and spans can have a place in that hierarchy when you need to separate certain content for formatting or for interaction with CSS or JavaScript. Some data lends itself to being displayed in a table. You can think of any data that you'd put into a spreadsheet as data that's destined for a table using HTML. Let's take a look at the tags that are required to create HTML tables. To get us started, I created a table with some of the New York Yankees players, their number and position. Tables are used anytime you might put information in a spreadsheet when the information fits in rows and columns. Let's take a look at the HTML structure of this table. So, of course, we have our basic document structure. I have some style information, and then in the body I have the table itself. There are 4 primary tags used to create a table. They are, first, the table tag, the TR or table row tag, the TH or table heading tag, and the TD or table data tag. And you can see they're used in a hierarchy. The table element contains the entire table. You can see our table starts with an opening table tag on line 20 and a closing table tag on line 60. The table is defined by its rows. The first row starts on line 21 and ends on line 23. Inside the row, there are 3 cells, each of which is contained in table heading tags. The table heading tags are formatted differently by the default style sheet than the table data tags. You can see we have column names in our table heading tags, name, number, and position. And then each row of data, starting with the row on line 24 through 26, contains 3 data cells. The player's name, and in row 1 it's Gary Sanchez, the player's number, in this row 24, and the player's position, catcher. In a table, you can have as many rows or columns as you need. Let's take a quick look at the CSS that I've used for this table. So on line 7, you'll notice we have a link to Google Fonts. I'm using one of the Google fonts to display the type in this table. And then in the table selector on line 9 within the style sheet, I set the entire font family for this table to P201, which is one of those Google fonts. On line 13 for our table tag, our table header tag, and our table data tag, I create a 2-pixel solid deep blue border. That's actually the New York Yankees blue. I then set the border collapse rule to collapse, and that results in a table looking like this. Notice the lines are solid around the entire table and around each individual cell. Without the border collapse rule, we'll go ahead and take it out here temporarily and re-render our table. You'll notice we get these double borders, which to me look like internet circa 1999. So the collapse rule collapses those borders into a single line. Let's put our collapse rule back, save, and render our table again. And there you can see now we've got the single line, which I think looks much better and more like the contemporary internet. There are many additional CSS rules we could apply, but since this is an HTML class, I want to stick to the very basics. A couple of additional tags that we can use with our tables. I'm going to go right up here before the first row, and I'm going to add a caption tag. And we'll just caption this New York Yankees partial roster. I typed this by hand, and I didn't want to type in all of the players on the New York Yankees. The caption is rendered right above the table, as you can see. It gives us a description for the table itself. Now, since we can't really use logical divisions in the table, they've given us a way of sectioning off the table into a header, the actual data, and the footer. We do that with, first off, the T-head tag. So I'm marking off a section of the table as the table header. And if we look at this in the browser, You will see it has no actual impact on the appearance of the table itself. The reason that we have these tags is so that we could use these for formatting. I could create a T-head selector here and create a background color rule of black and a text color of white, and it would apply to everything in that section of the table. There you can see it's applied our background color and our text color. We can also create in our table a body section, which in our table would start here on line 32 and go all the way through the end. Now, our table doesn't really have a footer, but if it did, we could add the T foot tag to mark off the footer for CSS formatting. Let's look at this second table, and you'll immediately notice something different. The space occupied by New York spans 3 separate rows. And in the second column, the space occupied by hockey spans 2 separate rows. This is called a row span, and I'll show you the tag here in a second. There's also something called a column span, which allows data to span multiple columns. Here's how we did it in the HTML. Again, we have a little bit of styling information for our table, creating the table with the font family Arial, collapsing the individual lines, and creating a 1-pixel solid black border between the cells. If we look at the table itself starting on line 21, you'll see the standard structure. We have the table tag, which opens at the beginning of the table and closes at the end of the table, and several table row elements. The first table row element contains our table headers, team name, sport, and state. But let's look at the second table row and notice the third table data entry, New York. It's got the row span equals 3 attribute and value inside it, meaning that this particular data will span 3 rows. And then take a look at the subsequent 2 rows, the row beginning on line 28 and the row beginning on line 31. Both only have 2 table data cells, Giants and football, and Knickerbockers and basketball. And of course, that's because the New York state information is already in the first row and spans the next 3 rows. Let's take a look at the bottom of the table for our second row span example. And there you can see the row that begins on line 37. The second table data has a row span of 2, and the data is hockey. And that, of course, is also used by the row for the Golden Knights. So row span can be very useful in creating more complex tables with HTML. Forms can be the most critical part of your website because that's how the user will communicate with the site. There are several different types of elements you can include in forms. We're going to review them in this segment. Let's get started. For this segment, I've created a really silly form which enables the user to subscribe to a fictional publication called 80s Weekly. Let's take a close look at the form. Inside the form, there's space for the user to type their first name, their last name, their email address, and then the user can use a checkbox to select one or more of the following categories that they're interested in. With checkboxes, they can select one, none, or all of the available options. Then there's a radio button, so they can choose between a print and digital description. Note how the radio buttons work together, where if one is clicked, the other is unselected. And finally, a drop-down, where they can choose their favorite band. I've also styled this using 80s fluorescent colors, which is pretty annoying, to be honest with you. Let's take a look at the HTML code that creates the actual form. I'll go over the CSS at the end. Let's go over the HTML. So you remember the first section of the form asked for the user's first name, last name, and email address. That's preceded by the form tag on line 51. A proper form tag should have an action attribute and a method attribute. The value of the action attribute should be the address where the form is going to be processed. This is usually done with back-end code. Code written in PHP, C#, some code running on a server that will process the results of the form and do something with it, like place it in a database, send an email, or create some type of log. The method has one of two possible values, post or get. Most of the time, it's going to be post. If you use the method post, the values that the user types into the form will be passed to the server in the header of the HTTP request. It'll be more or less invisible to the naked eye unless someone really knows where to look for it. If you use the method get, the results of the form are put inside a query string in the URL and will be visible inside the browser. Most people use post, given the option. Inside the form element are the form items the user is going to fill out. Notice there's a label for the first name and then an input. And if we were to look at the form itself, you can see the label, the text first name, and then the actual input, which now has my first name, Mark, inside of it. Then you see a label for last name, and then the form input, which has my last name in it. So the label tag creates the label. It has a for attribute. The for attribute needs to match the ID of the corresponding input. So notice on line 52, the label is for fname, abbreviated first name. And on line 53, the ID is fname. That's what links those two, links the label and the input. The linkage is important. Notice if I were to click on the label, the form field becomes active. That's why we link these two via the ID attribute. This is also important for accessibility, to make forms easier to fill out for somebody with a disability. The input itself is where the user is going to type their information. The first two inputs we have are the type text, for the user to type generic text. The ID ties the actual form field to the label, but also allows access to the form field through JavaScript. Sometimes forms are entirely processed by the JavaScript code. That's why the ID is very important. The name attribute is used to label the actual text if it's sent to a back-end server through the action in the form tag on line 51. Most of the time, I'll include both an ID and a name, but you do need to be aware of the separate functions of these attributes. The last name field is structured the same way. We use the input on line 55 to get the last name. The input type is text. The name of the field is lname, and the ID is lname. Again, the ID is used to tie this field in with any JavaScript that's used to process the form, and the name attribute is used to label the text if it's sent to a back-end form processor. The next text entry point is the email address. Notice we have label for email, the text email address, and then the corresponding input on line 57. The corresponding input is a little bit different, though. The type is email. And while it makes no actual difference in the way the form field appears on a desktop browser, if you were using this with a mobile device, when this field was active, you would get the specialized keyboard on the mobile device that makes it easier to enter an email address. This keyboard prominently displays the @ and may have common domain extensions like .com to make it easy for the user to type their email address. Input type email is one of several specialized input types. There are also types for entering dates and times, types for entering telephone numbers, and a few others. The next section of our document uses checkboxes that allow the user to individually check or not check each item. These checkboxes work as a set, so if they're processed by a form processor on the server side, it returns the information as an array. We use a single label for all the checkboxes. Notice the label's for attribute is interest, and the text is I am interested in. And then the ID of all of the inputs is also interest. Each input has an individual value, however. The value of the first one is music, the second is fashion, the third is movies, and so on. And then we use a text label that's friendly to the user in order to label these. So if the user checks off music and fashion, those two words will be returned to the actual processor on the server side that's processing this form. Remember that checkboxes are used when you want the user to select one, some, all, or none of a set of values. Our checkboxes are followed by radio buttons. Radio buttons are designed to be mutually exclusive. So the user can either select print subscription or digital subscription in this case, but not both. After the label for type and the text type of description, the radio buttons are identified by a name, an ID, and a value. Because the name of these has the same value, they're tied together and allow you only to select one radio button at a time. If we added a third radio button with the name equals type attribute value pair, it would also work in this set. The value is the text that's returned if the individual button is selected when the user fills out the form. Our final label is for the dropdown. It asks, which of these bands is your favorite? In this part of the form, we have a drop-down list that allows the user to select from several different 80s bands. This is accomplished with a select element. You'll notice the select element starts on line 69 and ends on line 76. Each of the individual values that the user can choose is in a different option element. We have several option elements starting on line 70, and the last one is on line 75. Each has text between the opening and closing option tag, and a value which again is returned to the server should the user select that individual value from the dropdown. The way our dropdown is configured, the user can only select a single band. We can add the attribute multiple equals multiple to allow the user to select more than one option from a dropdown. Our CSS includes a container, which creates a baseline font and some baseline colors for our form. You'll notice that we have selectors for the labels and input tags, as well as the select tags indicating individual colors and some margin space. Finally, we style the H1s with a specific font and the input and option elements with the pink fluorescent colors. So now we've looked at the fundamentals of form development with HTML. However, there is more you can do with advanced forms with the HTML language.